Hello. Before we get started on the different modules within the PRISM framework, I thought it would be useful to talk about what is going on inside our brain and body and how these finely balanced systems can and do affect our well-being. I'm not going to go into lots of detail in this video, but it is good to know about some of the different factors that affect your brain activity to help you understand how and why the techniques within PRISM work. The way stress, anxiety or depression manifests is different for every person, and so are the scenarios that may act as triggers. But generally speaking, anxiety and stress are triggered by a fear of either something that has happened or a fear of something that we believe may happen. No matter what's going on for you, you may experience one or many of these physical and emotional symptoms. Your heart races, your blood pressure increases, you breathe more quickly and shallow, you feel sweaty, shaky or short of breath. Maybe you feel lightheaded. Maybe you lack motivation and struggle to get up and out of bed. You feel overwhelmed or tired all the time, and maybe you suffer with poor sleep. You may lose your appetite and have a reduced sex drive, and you may experience muscular aches and pains. Whatever your experience is, it's very real and can be very distressing. So we will explore how calming your body will allow you to calm your mind. Our emotional response triggers a physical response and vice versa. Therefore, both need to be addressed. Our brains are made up of a complicated network of over 10 billion cells called neurons. These neurons are constantly transmitting and receiving messages both from activity within our body and from external stimuli via our senses of sound, sight, smell, taste and touch. Every thought and feeling we experience is a result of this brain activity. For our brains to work well, everything must be in balance. That means the right number of neurotransmitters, which are the messengers sending and receiving messages between neurons, must be released and in the right part of our brain to allow it to correctly interpret the messages it receives and to send the right messages in response. In other words, if there are too few neurotransmitters, our brains may not send a message, and if there are too many, the wrong message may be received. Where any imbalance in neurotransmitters occurs in the brain will impact how we respond to events. This can help us to understand why we experience stress, anxiety, and depression. From the moment we are born, our brains are learning. They do this by looking for repeating patterns in various stimuli and trying different responses to those stimuli. So, for example, as a baby hears its parents making cooing noises to them, it will attempt to make a noise back and may receive the reward of a smile or a cuddle. Over time, those cooing and gurgling noises become more sophisticated and the baby learns to talk. As adults, we are also constantly learning and responding to internal and external stimuli, and our brains are learning, changing and adapting. This is very important because whilst logically we are aware that stress and anxiety inducing situations can be handled calmly and effectively by some people, others have learnt to respond with panic and fear. The good news is that we can take back control and completely override that automatic response our brains have learnt and start to create new patterns of thinking through what is known as neuro or brain plasticity. Plasticity refers to our brain's ability to adapt and change and to make new connections. In effect, we can become our own teachers and teach ourselves to respond without anxiety or negatively. And the way to do this is through repetition. There are two types of neuroplasticity. Functional, so this is where the brain moves a function from a damaged area to an undamaged area of the brain. And structural. This is when the brain makes changes to its physical structure through learning and memory. The techniques shared in this program, which are broadly based on CBT, which stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, and NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, exploit the brain's structural plasticity to develop new connections between neurons. Let's take a deeper look at the role of neurotransmitters. Let's first take a look at what happens when we have too few neurotransmitters. Research has shown that people who experience anxiety and depression often have depleted levels of serotonin. Serotonin has been labelled as one of the feel-good hormones, as it plays a vital role in regulating our mood. Serotonin also helps stop us from worrying and feeling low, and helps us maintain a healthy appetite, controls impulses, and regulates our sleep and perception of pain. The neurotransmitter gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA for short, helps to calm activity in our nervous system. And so if we do not have sufficient GABA, we can find ourselves mentally and physically overreacting to situations that we would otherwise have not responded to. Likewise, not enough dopamine, the hormone involved in the pleasure and reward pathway of the brain, can cause us to feel low, lonely, and demotivated. We can also find it difficult to stay focused. We'll be looking at how diet and exercise can naturally boost your levels of serotonin and dopamine, as well as introducing techniques that can help trigger the pleasure-reward response. Having too many neurotransmitters can also cause us problems. When we respond to a perceived stressful situation, we release noradrenaline and cortisol. But if we release too much, this can lead to tension and panic. Similarly, if you have too much dopamine in the thinking part of our brain, known as the prefrontal cortex, we can find ourselves stuck in a cycle of negative thinking. We remember bad feelings we have linked to memories, which is what can cause us to panic or experience social anxiety when we are faced with a similar situation. We explore how we can override these automatic responses by deliberately engaging our prefrontal cortex to give our brains a different message. Over time, with repetition, this creates new neural pathways, and therefore this becomes the way our brain knows to respond. We experience many different situations our brain interprets as a threat, some of which are caused by a real and present danger, but many more are triggered by our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Our brains have not evolved to differentiate between the two types of threat. So this means that the part of our brain called the amygdala will initiate the fight or flight response in both scenarios. This means it increases blood flow and directs more white blood cells to the neural pathway associated with that train of thought. If the same response is repeated, our brains will bank the thought as something important to be remembered and repeated. The next time the same or something similar thing happens, our brains will try to initiate the same panicky or anxious response. And the more this happens, the more it happens. What we will be doing is showing our brains that the thought pattern is not significant anymore. In the same way our brains use repetition to create this negative response, we can use repetition to show it that we now respond in a calm, relaxed, and controlled way. Sex hormones also have a part to play here. Too little testosterone has been linked with increased anxiety. Not only that, testosterone plays a role in moderating and releasing of cortisol. So when testosterone levels are low, we may find our levels of the stress hormone cortisol increase. The female sex hormone, estrogen, may also be linked to anxiety symptoms. This is why women may find their anxiety levels are impacted at certain times during their menstrual cycle and during menopause. If you believe this may be happening for you, it's a good idea to keep a record of what is happening during a typical menstrual cycle. You can then decide whether you want to discuss this with your medical doctor. We will look at how we can naturally boost testosterone and a chemical called oxytocin to help combat the effect of some of our hormone deficiencies. And lastly, if you have an overactive thyroid, you may find you experience more of the physical symptoms linked to stress and anxiety. So now you have a high-level understanding of how different hormones may be impacting us. Let's now start to consciously take back control by starting the first module, Prepare. See you in the next video.